Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Picture this. It's late at night. You're walking to your car in a dark, empty parking lot. Suddenly, you hear screaming. A couple is having a violent, terrifying argument just a few rows away. You see a red flag. Things are getting out of hand. What do? Do you step in and risk your own safety? Do you call the cops and wait? Or do you mind your business and walk away? Welcome again to our channel, where we look at messy, real-life problems and use them to master advanced English. In today's story, A Line in the Sand, our protagonist, Garrett, faces this exact nightmare. As we follow his choice through 10 intense chapters, you're going to learn the native idioms, phrasal verbs, and vocabulary you need to talk about conflict, making hard decisions, and handling pressure in English. Before we find out what Garrett did, drop a comment below. What would you do in this situation? Hit that subscribe button, buckle up, and let's dive into Chapter 1. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed harsh 1:45 a.m. Garrett let out a heavy sigh, leaning his head against the steering wheel for a brief moment. He had just clocked out after a grueling 12-hour shift at the logistics warehouse, and every muscle in his body was aching. The massive retail parking lot was practically empty, shrouded in an eerie, thick fog that swallowed the distant streetlights. He usually loved this time of night because it gave him a rare chance to wind down and process his thoughts in total peace. He inserted the key into the ignition, ready to head home, when a piercing sound shattered the silence. It came out of the blue, a sharp, violent shatter of glass, followed immediately by the raw, echoing sound of a woman screaming. Garrett froze. His hand hovered over the ignition as his heart began to hammer against his ribs. He rolled his window down an inch, listening intently. The chilling noise cut right through the quiet night air, instantly catching his attention. Through the heavy mist, about 4 rows over, he could see the hazard lights of a dark SUV flashing rhythmically, casting long, dancing shadows on the wet asphalt. 2 figures were silhouetted against the blinking lights, their voices escalating in pitch and anger. Garrett's instincts screamed at him to just start the car and drive away, but something about the sheer terror in the woman's voice made him hesitate. He couldn't just ignore it. The peaceful end to his long night was gone, replaced by a sudden, dangerous reality.
Garrett squinted through his fogged-up windshield, trying to size up the situation without drawing attention to himself. The blinking hazard lights illuminated a tall man in a heavy jacket, towering over a woman who was backed up against the side of the SUV. The man slammed his open palm onto the roof of the vehicle, the loud metallic thud echoing across the empty parking lot like a gunshot. Garrett felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he watched the man aggressively point a finger directly in the woman's face. It was clear this wasn't just a regular couple's spat. The toxic energy vibrating from the man was undeniable. He was screaming so loudly that his voice was cracking, though the rolled-up windows of Garrett's car muffled the specific words. The woman's posture was completely defensive, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she shrank away from him. Garrett knew that relationships had their ups and downs, but this behavior completely crossed the line. Every instinct developed from his years of working in high-stress logistics environments told him that this situation could get out of hand at any second. He noticed the driver's side door of the SUV was wide open, and the faint sound of a car alarm began to beep, adding to the chaos. The man reached out and grabbed the edge of the car door, slamming it shut with a force that made the entire chassis shake. This was a massive red flag, and Garrett's mind raced as the gravity of the moment settled in. He was the only witness in sight, sitting in a dark corner of a vast, deserted lot while a dangerous dynamic played out just 50 yards away. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast before things turned physically violent.
Garrett sat frozen in the driver's seat, completely torn between his conscience and his common sense. His thumb hovered over the screen of his smartphone, debating whether he should dial 911 immediately or try to defuse the situation himself. A voice in the back of his head told him to just mind his own business, put the car in reverse, and go home to his warm bed. After all, getting involved in a domestic dispute was highly unpredictable, and he didn't want to put a target on his own Mac. He knew how easily these situations could turn on an outsider, and walking away would certainly be the safest bet for his own skin. Yet looking at the terrified posture of the woman through the mist, he felt a deep, sickening wave of guilt at the thought of turning a blind eye. If he chose to just drive off, he might be leaving someone completely helpless in the worst-case scenario of her life. He looked at the phone screen again, realizing that if he called the police, it could take 10 or 15 minutes for a squad car to arrive at this remote retail complex. By then, whatever was about to happen would already be over, and the damage would be done. His hands began to sweat against the steering wheel as the agonizing internal debate raged on. He could hear the man's muffled shouts growing sharper and more frequent, cutting through the damp night air like a blade. Every second he spent hesitating in the dark felt like a betrayal of his own moral compass. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the rising panic in his chest and find a logical way forward. He had to find a middle ground, a way to step in and disrupt the momentum of the fight without walking straight into a fistfight.
Before Garrett could make up his mind, the tense standoff near the SUV began to escalate rapidly. The woman turned her back on the man, shaking her head violently as she tried to walk away toward the main road. That sudden movement seemed to act as a trigger, causing the man to completely lose his cool. He lunged forward and grabbed her upper arm with a tight, aggressive grip to pull her back toward the vehicle. The violent jolt sent her large leather purse flying from her shoulder, hitting the wet asphalt with a loud slap. Keys, makeup, and loose coins scattered in every direction under the flashing amber hazard lights. The woman cried out, a sharp sound of genuine pain and fear that cut through Garrett's hesitation like a knife. Seeing the situation cross over into a physical altercation instantly made up Garrett's mind. The man looked like he was about to snap completely, his face twisted in rage as he pulled her closer to the open passenger door. Garrett couldn't sit behind his locked doors and just watch this happen anymore. The fear of what might happen if he stayed passive completely outweighed his fear of getting involved. He popped his seatbelt open, grabbed his heavy tactical flashlight from the center console, and pushed his car door open into the cold night air.
The cold, damp air hit Garrett's face as he stepped out of his car, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He knew that charging in like a hero would likely trigger a defensive, violent reaction from the angry man. Instead of screaming or threatening them, Garrett decided to use a calculated pretext to diffuse the tension. He switched on his flashlight, pointing the beam downward at the ground so it wasn't overly aggressive, and began walking calmly toward the SUV. He cleared his throat loudly, making enough noise to announce his presence before he got too close. "Hey there, sorry to bother you folks," Garrett called out in a casual, slightly confused tone, pretending he hadn't seen the struggle. Both figures froze instantly, turning their heads toward the sound of his voice. The unexpected interruption completely caught the man off guard, breaking the frantic momentum of his anger for a brief second. Garrett kept his hands visible and maintained a relaxed, non-threatening posture as he closed the distance between them. "I'm completely turned around out here," Garrett lied smoothly, playing it cool despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Do either of you know the quickest way to get back onto the northbound highway from this lot? He stopped about 15 feet away, leaving a safe distance while keeping his eyes locked on the man's hands. It was a risky move, but forcing them to acknowledge a polite stranger was his best shot at breaking the toxic spell of the argument.
The man turned his head sharply toward Garrett, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Mind your own business, man," he roared, taking a threatening step forward away from the vehicle. The hostile tone echoed off the wet asphalt, but Garrett stood his ground, keeping his flashlight pointed low. "Just asking for directions, buddy," Garrett replied calmly, trying to bear the brunt of the man's anger without escalating it. The man aggressively barked orders, gesturing wildly for Garrett to back off and get out of their space. "We don't know the highway and we don't care. Get the hell out of here before you regret it," the man screamed, his chest heaving. Despite the intense intimidation, Garrett noticed that his strategic distraction had successfully bought some time. The brief pause allowed the woman to break free from the man's tight grip while his attention was entirely turned elsewhere. She scrambled backward a few paces, her eyes wide with panic as she quickly wiped tears from her cheeks. Garrett kept his focus divided, watching the man's clenched fists while keeping a close eye on the escaping victim. He knew he was taking a massive risk by drawing the line right here in front of an unpredictable, furious stranger. But seeing the woman finally out of immediate physical danger meant his calculated gamble was working, even if he had to take the heat for it.
Garrett took a slow step backward, maintaining eye contact with the furious man while waiting for the woman to run to safety. Instead of fleeing, she dropped to her knees on the wet asphalt and frantically began scooping her scattered items back into her purse. "Hey, are you all right?" Garrett asked her, keeping his voice gentle but loud enough to carry through the fog. To his absolute surprise, the woman looked up at him with a mix of panic and deep resentment. "Leave us alone! We're fine!" she yelled at Garrett, her voice cracking with raw emotion. Garrett froze as this unexpected plot twist caught him completely off guard, leaving him momentarily speechless. The woman stood up, stepping closer to the man and placing a protective hand on his arm, shielding him from Garrett. It was a jarring realization for Garrett, who was suddenly forced to witness a complicated, real-time dynamic up close. He could see the symptoms of a deep trauma bond, where fear and misplaced loyalty caused the victim to side with the aggressor. By stepping into their private crisis, Garrett had inadvertently united them against him, putting himself on the spot as the common enemy. The man smirked, clearly emboldened by the woman's defense, and crossed his arms over his chest. "You heard her, hero," the man sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Get lost." Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs as he stood under the blinking hazard lights, trying to process how quickly the tables had turned. Garrett realized that trying to play the hero was no longer a viable option in this twisted situation. The complicated dynamic between the couple meant that any further verbal intervention on his part would only make him a target. He took 2 deliberate steps backward into the shadows, keeping his hands up and visible to show he was retreating. "All right, I'm backing off," Garrett said clearly, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the lingering adrenaline. He reached into his pocket with his left hand and pulled out his smartphone, illumination from the screen lighting up his face. Instead of hiding his actions, he decided that a visible deterrent was the best way to handle the situation now. He dialed the emergency numbers and pressed the speakerphone button, letting the loud ringing tone echo through the damp air. "I'm calling the cops," Garrett announced loudly, ensuring both of them could hear him over the humming engine of the SUV. The man's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden flash of panic as reality set in. Garrett walked a few more feet away, raised his flashlight, and shone the beam directly onto the rear license plate of the vehicle. He began to read the numbers aloud, shouting them clearly so the emergency dispatcher and the couple could hear every digit. "I have a domestic altercation at the retail parking lot on 5th Street, Garrett stated firmly into the phone. By holding them accountable to the law, Garrett shifted the power dynamic entirely without having to use physical force.
The loud ringing of the speakerphone and the steady glare of the flashlight completely broke the man's resolve. Hearing that the police were officially being looped in, he let out a stream of angry curses and spun around on his heel. He didn't waste another second. He lunged into the driver's seat of the SUV and slammed the heavy door shut behind him. The woman stood frozen on the damp asphalt for a split second, looking down at her purse and then back at Garrett with a look of pure exhaustion. As the engine roared to life, she made her choice, quickly opening the passenger door and climbing inside before the car could leave her behind. The tires screeched violently against the wet surface, and the dark vehicle began to speed off, hightailing it toward the western exit of the lot. Garrett watched the red taillights vanish into the thick fog, leaving in a hurry as if they were running from a ghost. He lowered his phone, letting out a massive breath he didn't realize he had been holding all this time. His knees felt weak, and he could feel the intense, lingering adrenaline making his hands shake as the immediate danger finally passed. He leaned against the hood of his own car, counting his blessings that the confrontation hadn't devolved into an actual physical fight. The parking lot was suddenly dead silent again, save for the distant, faint sounds of sirens beginning to echo from blocks away. The whole encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but the heavy atmosphere of what had just occurred hung thick in the night air.
The flashing blue and red lights of a police cruiser cut through the heavy fog, painting the wet asphalt in vibrant colors. Garrett stood calmly by his car, waiting as a pair of officers walked over to take his official statement. He walked them through the timeline of the events, giving a detailed description of the physical altercation and providing the dispatcher with the exact license plate numbers he had read aloud. The officers thanked him for his quick thinking, noting that his phone call likely prevented a dangerous situation from turning much worse. Yet, as the police cruiser finally drove away, a wave of profound mixed feelings washed over Garrett in the quiet night air. He climbed back into his own driver's seat, staring out at the empty rows of the parking lot where the chaos had just unfolded. In hindsight, he couldn't help but wonder if his decision to speak up had truly helped the woman or if it had simply delayed an inevitable tragedy. Would the man's rage explode again behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of helpful strangers? He realized that stepping up to do the right thing in the real world rarely results in a neat, perfect ending with a bow on top. It was heavy food for thought, a complicated dilemma that would likely keep him awake long after he finally arrived home. He started his engine, turned on his headlights, and drove slowly out of the deserted lot, permanently changed by the thin line between being a bystander and a protector.
What a heavy ending for Garrett. It really shows that in real life, Doing the right thing isn't always easy, and it doesn't always have a perfect ending. But now, I want to hear from you. In hindsight, do you think Garrett did the right thing by stepping in? Or did he just make things worse for the woman later? Let's talk about it in the comments below. We covered some incredibly useful, high-level English today. Phrases like to wind down, out of the blue, to bear the brunt, and food for thought are exactly what native speakers use when discussing intense, real-life dilemmas. If you want to master these terms, make sure to check out the full vocabulary breakdown linked in the description below. If today's story helped you improve your English and gave you some food for thought, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps the channel grow so we can keep learning together. Keep practicing and stay safe out there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.